Dear friends, welcome to yet another installment of Strategic Power. With Sweden's entry into NATO, Russia finds itself surrounded in the Baltic Sea. Putin responds with threats, while Zelensky aspires to NATO support in Ukraine. Could this mounting pressure trigger World War III? Watch to the end for a more detailed analysis of this topic. Before we begin, if you haven't already, consider subscribing and turning on notifications to stay up to date on new videos. Emmanuel Macron, in an apparently improvised speech, mentions the possibility that France might send troops to fight in Ukraine. NATO reacted with surprise at that statement, without issuing an official position. This pronouncement seems to be an isolated opinion from the French president. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin stated, "If there is an intervention in Ukraine, I consider that a step towards World War III, because it will inevitably result in the union of several NATO countries against Russia, possibly with support from Iran, North Korea, and even China." This could lead to the much-feared World War III, as current leaders seem to be acting in a way that promotes it, at least in rhetoric. However, NATO has already stated that it will not send troops to Ukraine. Meanwhile, on the other side, Volodymyr Zelensky, in Kyiv, faces the situation with concern, as his desire is for NATO to intervene in Ukrainian territory to definitively expel the Russians. It would then be left to the Ukrainian army to deal with the powerful Russian army. As we know, for almost a year, Ukraine has failed to break Russian lines, and Russia is advancing its plan to dominate the east and south, which will now not be easily reversed. The siege has been completed. Now Russia finds itself under NATO's influence. With Sweden's accession, the entire Baltic Sea is under the control of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The last country needed to consolidate this dominance over this important maritime route is now integrated into the alliance, closing the encirclement in northern Europe and extending the border with Russia. Only the border of Ukraine remains to complete the encirclement. Hungary was the last country to support Sweden's entry into NATO, and this occurred in exchange for certain armaments. The Hungarian president, Orbán, visited Sweden and expressed the need for such equipment, mainly state-of-the-art fighter jets. This negotiation, where armaments were granted in exchange for NATO membership, made Sweden's entry into the alliance official. This is an important point, as Norway, Sweden, and Finland, territories historically influenced by Russia, are now under NATO's sphere. These countries, which in the past were subject to Russian will, including Finland, which came into conflict with Russia, represent an area of tension. With the inclusion of Sweden, it is perceived that the only portion of the Baltic Sea still under Vladimir Putin's control is the small Kaliningrad region. Kaliningrad is under Russian possession, representing a small territorial strip and a maritime area of territorial waters under Russian control. This region houses both commercial and military fleets from Russia. However, with the inclusion of the coastlines of Finland, Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland under NATO's sphere, there has been a significant decrease in Russian influence in the Baltic Sea. The implications of this change with Sweden's entry into NATO and the reduction of Russian influence in the Baltic Sea can be observed in the context of the war in Ukraine. Russia is consolidating its control over eastern and southern Ukraine, including access to the Black Sea and Sea of Azov, with Crimea under its rule since 2014. This creates pressure on the Russians not to give up control of southern Ukraine, as previously it was speculated that this area could be a bargaining area. Now, with the decrease in Russian influence in the Baltic Sea, it is likely that the Russians will insist on maintaining control over this strategic maritime outlet. It is important to note that Russia maintains commercial and military fleets in Crimea, which has been under Russian rule since 2014. This situation affects the war scenario in Ukraine, as pressure on NATO to intervene more decisively in support of Ukraine may increase, seeking to regain control of the southern part of the country. Sea access has a crucial economic meaning for a country. It facilitates exports and imports, avoids dependence on the protectionism of other nations, and eliminates the need to obtain authorizations to use ports and transport routes. Therefore, Ukraine, as a major producer and exporter of grains, especially wheat, which depends on those ports to export to North Africa and Asia, will face significant challenges. As Vladimir Putin feels more pressured, he will be less willing to agree to a ceasefire, armistice, or peace agreement. The more cornered he is, the firmer his response will be. Although Russia has access to the sea in the north of the country, It is important to note that for part of the year, the waters in those areas freeze over, severely hampering the use of ports and increasing transportation costs. In addition, the route becomes longer, further increasing export and import costs. Another challenge is that by using those ports in northern Russia, ships are forced to pass through a strait between Iceland and Great Britain. Since Great Britain is a NATO member and has one of the world's leading navies, there is a risk that this route can be closed off, further economically isolating Russia and preventing its ships from transporting goods to other countries. In addition, the apparently improvised statement by French President Emmanuel Macron about the possible sending of troops to Ukraine causes additional concerns. NATO's reaction to that statement suggests it is an individual position and does not necessarily reflect the alliance's official policy. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin stated that any intervention in Ukraine could lead to World War III, arguing that this would inevitably provoke a joint response from several NATO countries against Russia, possibly with support from Iran, North Korea, and even China. This rhetoric feeds fears of an escalation towards a global conflict, especially considering the perceived efforts of current leaders to create this narrative. However, NATO has already stated it will not send troops to Ukraine. On the other hand, Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv expressed his frustration, since his desire is for NATO to intervene in Ukrainian territory to expel the Russians, leaving the Ukrainian army to face the powerful Russian military machine. However, as observed, Ukraine has faced difficulties breaking Russian lines in recent months, allowing Russia to advance its plan to dominate eastern and southern parts of the country. In regards to the question of how Vladimir Putin will respond to the increased NATO membership and whether he interprets it as provocation or possible invasion, it is a complex issue subject to varying interpretations. This is an extremely delicate situation that requires careful analysis of the actions and statements of the leaders involved. If you wish to share your opinion on the topic, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe to the channel.